I'm Deon Pretorius. I'm a sociologist and development specialist. I have a PhD from the University of Warwick in the UK, and most of my work over the last number of years have focused on the morphogenetic approach to local development, and much of it focuses on the importance of leadership for morphogenetic development. To explain the morphogenetic approach, I need to explain it against the background of the problems that I identify in societal systems, the critical questions that I pose, and the approach that I adopt. I'm concerned with the problem of social systems like South Africa that is characterized by acute inequality. My views on this is informed by work that I've been able to do in places like the Sundays River Valley in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. My work involves a focus on leadership, and the critical question is, what type of leadership is required to get the process of societal development going? Very briefly, my answer is informed by the morphogenetic approach that is based on the work of British sociologist Margaret Archer. Her work places emphasis on systemic analysis, whereas my work places emphasis on using the morphogenetic approach as a strategic means for facilitating societal development. The word morphogenesis or morphogenetic can be puzzling to some people. It's actually not so complicated. The morph part of the word refers to change from one condition to another, and the genesis or genetic part of it refers to change resulting from internal dynamics. I'll explain this later, but it essentially refers to the interplay between context and agency over time. And it also implies change from within instead of externally imposed change. Conceptually, two important concepts to understand the morphogenetic approach is context and agency. Context, on the one hand, can be divided into structure and culture, or alternatively, idea systems. Structure then refers to the distribution of power, wealth, ownership, resources, assets, capacity, and access to opportunities to improve life chances. The distribution thereof, the patterns of distribution. So that's the structure. Culture or idea systems refer to the distribution of ideas, values, ideologies, beliefs, knowledge, mindsets, etc. Again, the relationship between those and the patterns that they take on. On the other hand, agency then referred to people in the sense of individuals and groups of people acting in pursuit of interests in specific contexts. To explain how societal, and that means systemic change occurs, one needs to analyze the relationship of the morphing of context and agency. For the purposes of facilitating societal development, the process of development can be depicted as stages in which context, which in other words refers to structure and culture, and agency morphs through an ongoing interplay with one another. If one presents this graphically, one can present it by way of a sequence of context and agency relationships, one following after the other, in which, for instance, C1 and A1 results in C2 and A2. These stages are not neat, linear, and predictable, but must conceptualized as cumulative and staged for strategic and planning purposes. Using the morphogenetic approach, I argue that one can detect three interrelated problems or dilemmas in the South African societal system. The first is structural inequality. This refers to the unequal distribution of power, resources, and means to a better life. The patterned manifestation thereof can be depicted in a pyramid-like stratification system, or by way of a system that is presented by way of a circle which contains a set of minuses and pluses. The minuses referring to those in the society who have less opportunity or are constrained in terms of achieving a good quality of life. And the pluses refers to those who have a greater opportunity to achieve a better quality of life. In the South African context, the relationship between pluses and minuses typically takes on a ratio of about 80 to 20, where there are about 20% of pluses and 80% of minuses. And that shows the inequality, the structural inequality, the imbalance, and provides an answer to the question about the underlying causes of conflict and strain and contestation in the South African society. So I prefer to use a depiction that uses the circle and thereby talking about a system in which everyone in that system are interdependent on one another, whether they like it or not. One need to also point out when you talk about inequality in a country like South Africa that this is not just an ideological statement or a matter of guesswork. We have various forms of statistics and empirical evidence that shows and measures the nature and extent of inequality. One amongst those is the Gini quotient, which is used internationally to measure distribution of wealth in a society. And in this regard, the gap between the rich and the poor in South Africa is consistently found to be the greatest amongst all countries that are measured for the Gini quotient. So that's the first problem, structural inequality. The second problem that accompanies the structural inequality problem in a country like South Africa is the problem of exclusive ideas and ideologies and excessive contestation amongst these different sets of ideas. For instance, the contestation between capitalism and socialism, or the idea of whether the market should be the driving force of an economy or whether the state should play a key and primary role. This leads to an inadequate consensus about important ideas for development solutions. The third problem that we have in a country like South Africa is disagreement with regards to agency. This has got to do with the question of who takes responsibility or primary responsibility and secondary responsibility, and what type of roles and functions are to be performed by which sections of society with regards to addressing the problems that are facing a country like South Africa. The ideological problem or the ideational problem can also be depicted in a graph in which the horizontal axis refers to time and the vertical axis refers to the progression from exclusive quality of life to inclusive quality of life. The challenge is to move from exclusive to inclusive. And in the South African ideological debate about how to respond to that challenge, we essentially have three options. The one is a revolutionary option, which occurs very rapidly in time and very rapidly moves from exclusive to inclusive quality of life. But because of the speed at which this process takes place, certain important institutional and systemic developments does not get enough time to occur, and that rapid improvement typically results in a very rapid decline. So the first option of a revolutionary approach to solving this structural inequality problem is not a desirable one. The alternative, directly opposite solution, is for a process of change that takes very long and moves slowly from exclusive to inclusive quality of life. The problem, though, is the challenges facing a country like South Africa are so acute and so urgent that such a slow pace of change, or some people might refer to it as evolutionary reform, is simply not adequate in terms of bringing about systemic change. The undesirable features of the South African society keep on reproducing itself at a pace that is greater than the slowness of evolutionary reform. So obviously one can expect that certain categories of people in the society would be in favor of the revolutionary approach and others would be in favor of the evolutionary approach. So by just talking about that in general terms, if we go back to the notion of the pluses and the minuses, clearly the minuses would be in favor of a revolutionary approach, and the pluses are those who benefit from the status quo, and they would clearly not want to have a process of change which is dramatic, rapid, and brings about an alternative status quo or an alternative to the current status quo. The alternative to these two undesirable alternatives is what we call development, but development as a process that is approached as urgent, that is approached in a planned fashion and approached in a way that is goal-driven, moving from the undesirable status quo to the desired future. We must not be naive about the nature of such a development process. It is highly unlikely that it will be a smooth, linear, non-stop process. It's much more likely that given the realities of a country like South Africa, and for that matter, any society, that the process will be an undulating, stop and start, non-linear process that will, even at some stages, turn back and have to be restarted. This is just part of the reality of the complex environment and the inevitable contestation that happens around processes like development. It is possible to depict the desired future as a vision of the future, and one could use a set of indicators. One could even use the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals as a set of indicators for the purposes of defining the desirable future. The important thing is that such a desirable future must be a pragmatic, realistic, and reachable goal. And the same indicators that you use to define the desirable future should be used to set your goalposts from your current undesirable status quo in intervals up to reaching the desired future. It also implies that you have to use the same set of indicators to portray and to profile the status quo, the baseline from which the development process starts. The agency problem is a complex one, which can be described against a background of multiple possible scenarios to the question of who should be responsible for leading and guiding the process of societal development. For some people, it's the dominant political party. Other people use the term the development state, or a strong state, or a capable state. Other people talk about the vanguard party. Other people talk about the minimalist state. And when they talk about the minimalist state, they suggest that market forces and other dynamics should play an important role. And there are other variations on the theme. The problem that we have in the South African society and countries like South Africa is that we cannot depend on a single agency, whether that be a political party, the state, the market, or whatever mechanism or agency we want to refer to. In a country like South Africa, we simply do not have a choice but for these entities to work together with one another. In a country like South Africa, we simply have no choice but to opt for an alternative in which these different sectors of society and agencies have to work together with one another. And this has simply got to do with a problem of limited capacity. Each and any of those that we may mention will have a problem of too limited capacity. So what we require, according to the approach that I'm propagating, is nonpartisan party political collaboration. In other words, in some instances, yes, political parties will have to contest and they will contest with one another. But in other important areas where we're talking about things of development priorities, political parties need to overcome their excessive contestation and they need to work together with one another in a non-partisan fashion. Over and above that, we also need the different sectors of society, and with that I mean state, business, labor, civil society, and other sectors of society, if there are others that you want to add to that, need to also work together with one another. Instead of a situation where, for instance, we are only dependent on the state, or for instance, at a local government level, the municipality to be the agent of local development. All these sectors, municipality, business, labor, civil society, need to work together in what I call a multi-sectoral co-responsibility model. I argue that this is a strategic imperative. We don't have a choice in a country like South Africa. The implication of that is that we also need a certain type of leadership. This is leadership that are capable of making sustainable systemic development happen. And they must be capable of contributing to this multi-sectoral way of making decisions and making development happen. They must be able to think systemically, which means that they must be able to see the bigger picture and get beyond their own self-interest, and they must be able to think developmentally, and critically, they must be able to collaborate. So the term that we use for development is qualified by the term collaboration. We prefer to use the term collaborative development. So this is the short answer to the initial question that was posed, and that is, what type of leadership? It is leadership that have these qualities that I have just pointed to, but more than that, it is also leadership that is capable, and this is particularly relevant when we talk about leadership at a local level. It is leadership that is capable of morphing from one form or type of leadership to another, depending on the context. So the leadership here is the agency, and the context is the other important element in this ongoing interplay between context and agency in a system like South Africa. So the morphing over time in particular contexts, as the contexts change, and leadership being able to respond appropriately given the changing realities. Ultimately, leaders in a South African development context must be able to collaborate and to facilitate development. There is a specific and special role for grassroots leadership, community level leadership, township level leadership. We're talking decentralized, which means that we are suggesting that the most important agents of development are the ones that are at a micro level in society and are able to engage with ordinary people of society in order to make sure that the issues that are being addressed are relevant to bringing about quality of life changes in the lives of ordinary people. We can depict this multi-sectoral co-responsibility development as something that is akin to a wagon wheel with development in the middle. And instead of just one spoke or one particular sector of society, we have multiple sectors that form spokes to this big wheel. So the state, business, labor, faith-based organizations, international partners, communities or civil society, professional and academics, all have a contribution to make. But the important point is that none of these have all the answers. None of them have in themselves and on their own sufficient capacity to address the development challenges of South Africa on their own. And the collaborative approach says that in order to overcome that limitation, they need to learn to work together with one another. For the purposes of facilitating local development, it is possible to depict the process of development over time in identifying 4 generic stages of development. And the terms that are used for this purpose are used deliberately to resonate with a South Africa and an international development debate and discourse. So the first stage of development can be described as creating enabling conditions for development. The second stage is system and institutional transformation. The third is emergent transformative outcomes. And the fourth is inclusive well-being or inclusive quality of life. 4 stages that follow on one another theoretically. The following on one another and the sequencing will never be neat and categorical. But the important thing is that there is a sequence and that there is a certain maturity that needs to be reached in every stage before the next stage can fully unfold. And that means in practical terms that if one has not facilitated the creation of enabling conditions for development in a local community or in a locality, it's highly unlikely that the next stage of development, which is the very complex and complicated process of transforming systems and institutions from the currently undesirable way of functioning, which means that it produces and reproduces structural inequality, towards systems and institutions that undo structural inequality and promotes inclusive well-being. So if the enabling conditions have not been created, that process of systemic and institutional transformation, you can attempt to make that happen, but the chances that you're going to be successful in making it sustainable would be highly unlikely. And if you have then achieved a sufficient level of institutional and systemic transformation, the interesting dynamic then is that transformative outcomes start emerging as if by themselves, not requiring ongoing intervention, because the systems and the institutions of society are starting to function according to a different logic, and they start looking after change by itself. And then the ultimate goal that we want to achieve, as far as I'm concerned, in any society at any time in the world, is one which can be described by the terms of inclusive well-being. That's the long-term goal that we would want to achieve, not just in South Africa, but for that matter, any country and any society in the world. Any society in the world, in my view, should optimally be one that makes provision for a good quality of life for all the people that live in that society. If we achieve that, we have achieved development. Now, stage 1 can be then broken up into a number of different actions that needs to be taken. This very important prerequisite for development, which I have just referred to, which we call creating enabling conditions for development. Through experiential learning, through working in actual practical context in communities over the last number of years, these are lessons that have been learned. They are not taken from a textbook. They have emerged from learnings by engaging at a community level and understanding what needs to be done in order to make development possible and to make development sustainable. So we have 15 actions that are required, and they can be articulated in different ways and be described in different contexts in different ways, but these are the generic descriptions. In the first instance, it is important, if one embarks on a process of community development, local development, systems development, societal development, you need to demarcate the societal system that you focus on. In other words, you need to identify boundaries, whether these are geographical or specifically targeted communities. You need to identify who it is that's inside that system and who needs to become part of the process and the solution. Secondly, if the status quo is characterized by extensive contestation and conflict, it is necessary to bring about a cessation or a reduction of hostilities. Leaders or adversaries must be convinced to hold their fire and refrain from conflicting interaction so that talking and listening can be possible. You cannot fight and talk at the same time. So that is a prerequisite, and if required, a professional mediator, that is a conflict manager, must be brought into such a situation to calm things down so that people can at least start talking to one another and start listening to one another. Thirdly, very closely to this point, is that one needs to then create conditions for dialogue. And one is not talking about negotiation here. One is really just talking about dialogue with the intention of getting to deeper understanding across the divides in that community and society. So it's not just talking, it's not deliberating, it is dialogue, it's discussion with the intention of understanding empathetically, getting to understand the other party. Fourth, there is always a need for what I refer to as internal initiators. There is a need for a few people within that system to put up their hands and to become part of the solution, to be willing to step out of tune with their compatriots and comrades and those who they have been aligned with, and to question whether the solutions that have been sought and applied have actually been working. Internal initiators put up their hands and say, listen, I'm willing to think out of the box. I'm willing to ask different questions and to pursue different solutions. There is always, and this is the fifth one, a need for an independent external facilitator, a knowledgeable, developmentally minded, possibly an expert, independent facilitator that has got no vested interests in that system. And then sixth, you need an internal, non-partial coordinator, a trusted, honest, capable, hard worker that keeps the process going on the ground. This person must be trusted and accepted across the spectrum of different socio-political categories. 7, action that is required is to conduct what can be called a context agency analysis, a qualitative, quantitative analysis in which we look at the context, in other words, the distribution of power, resources, means, and access to such assets, and agency, on the other hand. Who are the people? Who are the stakeholders? What are the means that they have at their disposal? What are the capacities do they have to make a contribution to development? 8, we need to facilitate the morphing of leadership. So very soon in such a process, one must identify the activists, the leaders, and start working with them with the intention of convincing them that there is a need for them to shift from adversarial activism to collaborative development. This is not easy and links with the next item, number 9, and that is mindset morphing. The mindsets need to morph. They need to morph from a perception that growth and development is not possible towards one which is, it is possible, and particularly a mindset that says that change is only possible by way of confrontation, to a mindset that says change is possible through collaboration. 10, instead of searching for the ultimate approach or having an ongoing contestation between different approaches, what is preferable is to have an overall, very generic, heuristic type of approach, which can be used as a canopy or an umbrella in which a diversity of different approaches can be included. For instance, if you prefer an ABCD, which is an asset community development approach, or an approach that places emphasis on entrepreneurial development, or an approach that places emphasis on any specific aspect of this bigger system, it's preferable that those different approaches be considered and modified if necessary to fit into a complex of different approaches that complements one another instead of trying to choose between the one or the other. 11, one need to focus on bringing all the relevant perspectives into the picture. In other words, how do different sectors of society look at the status quo? How do they define the problem? How do they see the reasons and the causes? And how do they see possible solutions? The emphasis is on perspectives, and thus we prefer to not use the word stakeholder, although that's not necessarily wrong, but focusing on perspectives is more useful to help us understand that it is about understanding different points of view and understanding the complexity of a situation in terms of how people perceive it and see it from their particular point of view. Linking with the morphing of leadership and the mindset morphing that I referred to earlier, together with the earlier mentioned morphing of leadership and the morphing of mindsets, Action 12 refers to the training of leaders to enable them to be skillful in collaborating with one another across different sectors of society. So we are talking about actual training programs that needs to be acquired or developed in order to build that capacity. I believe that the human inclination for collaboration and cooperation is inherent in humans. However, distortions resulting from societal systems and institutions that function in ways that accentuate self-interest have resulted in people not being so inclined to collaboration as their natural inclination would want them to be. This training would build on that natural inclination and capacity in human beings to work together, and most of the time people are actually surprised about how easy that happens once you understand the necessity of working together with others and that you understand that working with others is actually in your own interest. 13, this work requires a process of organizational morphing. This means moving from informal organization and mobilization around demonstration projects to institutionalizing the process of development into an organization like any other organization, which consists of people that are appointed, salaried, have formal job descriptions, and need to do a job in order to get the process of societal development happening. So this can take the form of an NGO, it can take the form of development agencies, it can even take on the form of transforming a local government or a department of a local government to perform that role and function. 14, we need quality data and information, and we need to use information and communication technology to the best way that is possible to promote development and to promote accurate information to inform the actions that we take. To have baseline data, to have data to monitor and to evaluate impact, and to be able to effectively communicate, get the message out to whoever needs to know, whoever needs to be informed, and whoever needs to collaborate with those that are part of the process of collaborative development. Finally, number 15, there is what we call low-hanging fruit, and this is just a metaphor that is used to describe projects that can be used in order to make rapid progress. This process that I'm describing inevitably takes time, and people in contexts like this are impatient, and so you need to have some rapid progress. And thus one needs to pick projects or actions that can achieve this goal of short-term success, but it is very important that one must not identify initiatives or projects that are high risk, too expensive, difficult to achieve. So we want to have success, and we want to have it relatively quickly. The most important feature of such projects in this particular context is that they must be identified as non-trivial. They must be significant, but mostly they must provide us with opportunities for people that have in the past, leaders who have in the past not been willing or inclined to work together with one another, to learn to work together, to learn to collaborate, so that one can form teams and groups of people that focus on a particular problem with the intention of solving it and learning that they can actually achieve success together. So that was stage one. And roughly speaking, in the type of contexts in which I've been working, one can actually put a time frame on it. It probably takes at least a year to 2 years to achieve that set of actions. And for that morphing to take place. So remember, we are talking about a transformation process that is actually happening on the level of individuals and structures in the societal system. The next stage, stage 2, systems and institutional transformation, is the most important part of the development process. This is the one in which the institutions and the systems that keep the status quo intact will be transformed so that they start performing their role and function in society in a different way. This is by far the hardest work and requires a certain measure of expertise. Sociologists typically do well in doing this kind of work because they understand societal systems and institutions. So in this instance, we move from low-hanging fruit to institutions and systems. And when we talk about institutions and systems, we really talk about all the relevant systems and institutions, relevant in the sense that being the sites, the localities within a societal system where the unwanted status quo is being produced and reproduced. It happens within the family, it happens within the health system, the education system, the economy, the political system, sport, recreation, art, culture, media. It happens in almost all spheres of society, which means that we are talking about comprehensive societal transformation in terms of all of these systems and institutions. And it's desirable that you have teams of people that work in those different spheres of activity, institutional spheres, that have a passion for that have an interest, and they have an expertise, and understand what happens in the education system, understands what happens in an economy, that can work with one another and analyze those institutions and ask the question, how does it happen that this particular institution, together with other institutions, remember they are linked to one another in vicious cycles, like the family and health and education and the economic system are linked to one another. So you need to start delving into and exploring this institutional and systemic dynamics to work out how is it that they function in a particular way so as to produce and reproduce the ongoing socio-economic inequality that you have in a particular society. And those answers are not going to be easily found. And they should not be simple ideological answers that are just based on some political ideology. They need to emerge from some serious reflection. So if we can understand what is referred to as the generative mechanisms, what is it in those institutions and systems that's responsible? What are the causal variables that bring about a particular undesirable situation? Then we can move on to ask the positive question, which is, if that is then what produces the negative, what are the mechanisms whereby we can produce the positive outcomes? And the things that we need to look at are usually not manifested in a physical and concrete sense of the word. The things that we typically should focus on are not easy to identify. They're invisible, they're relational, they're interactive. They have to do with societal structures which are not physical structures, but are institutions that are made up of things like norms and values and practices and powers and capacities and resources, mindsets, attitudes, ideas, ideologies. All these things are the kind of relational things between people that take on a certain shape or form that justifies, reinforces, and contributes to making a certain societal arrangement possible. If we have identified those, then the next question, as I say, is what is it that needs to be focused on to undo this undesirable set of outcomes or these vicious cycles that keeps on reproducing themselves, and how do we turn that then into virtuous cycles? In other words, to construct progressive institutional functionality. This is our highest priority. This is the most important work for us to do as development facilitators, and that is to achieve the identification of these negative generative mechanisms and positive generative mechanisms and facilitate the process of moving from the one to the other. Another very important part of the work at this stage, in stage 2, is to place more focus on the link between projects and programs on the one hand and systemic impact and sustainable change and development on the other hand. Too often we are inclined to focus on achieving specific objectives and to almost become obsessed with the completion of the project. And very often that is insufficient for making lasting and systemic change. We need to understand and deliberately focus on that which is necessary to bring about sustainable and desirable change of the features of societal systems and institutions. And as I said, we need to understand those generative mechanisms. We have to see projects and programs as the means to the end. The ends that we are focusing on are the sustainable societal systemic difference that we need to make, the impact that we need to make, and ultimately to achieve inclusive quality of life or inclusive well-being. For instance, in the South African context, as explained earlier, because of the lack of capacity that we have in many sectors of society, particularly in a local government context, the focus must be on changing the institutional arrangements, not only within government, but in the bigger system, from dynamics and relationships, projects and programs that focus on a single agency addressing the societal challenge towards an approach that solves the capacity problem, which is a collaborative approach. So a collaborative approach is not just, another project. A collaborative project is not just another project. A collaborative project is a step towards transforming the system from a monopolistic system towards a plural and collaborative system in which multiple agencies take responsibility, not just for one project, but for the society going into the future, as long as that is required. And that is the way to do things that is in the interest of everyone in society. Stage 3 and 4, one does not need to elaborate on too extensively. Stage 3, which is labeled as emergent transformative outcomes. Much of the process of development that we are talking about here is dependent on a kind of a almost mysterious process of emergence of certain societal features, qualities, changes in relationships, even changes in people, the morphing that happens as an outcome, sometimes even an unintended outcome. It emerges. It happens when context and agency interplays with one another. So stage 3 is what happens when institutional systems start functioning as they are supposed to function, which means that they serve society in a general sense of the word. And if they start performing that function after a while, then the transformative results emerge by themselves, and the role of intervening development agents, facilitating a process of change, becomes less and less and less. So your independent external facilitator, for instance, initially is intensely involved in the process of collaborative development. But as these systems and institutions become transformed, that person needs to have a sense of judgment to pull back, and to allow the players, the parties, the agents within the system to take a more and greater responsibility. Finally, stage 4 refers to inclusive well-being or inclusive quality of life. This is, as I said, the long-term ultimate development goal. And the only really important point that I want to make in this regard is that, as already implied, societal transformation or societal development does not just refer to, for instance, the economy, or to infrastructure, or to housing, or to government, or to governance, or to education. It refers to all of those, or at least it refers to all of those in a country like South Africa. So it is a holistic, multifaceted, complex goal that we pursue, which entails psychological, spiritual, social, cultural, physical, material, or economic, political well-being as the end state, as the desirable future. final word is that we need not see these stages as neatly following onto one another. More specifically, it would be unrealistic to think that a stage needs to be completed before a next stage can start. That might mean that one needs to stop certain things in society to wait for prior development to achieve a certain level. That's unrealistic. Instead, one should appreciate the simultaneity of different processes occurring at the same time and overlapping with one another. However, at any given point in time, one of these stages should be the highest priority, and one should work out where you are in terms of the sequence and not start prioritizing systemic and institutional transformation if you should still be prioritizing the creation of the enabling conditions to make your systemic and institutional transformation sustainable and in fact possible.